Hello, this is Brian P., and welcome to Scaling the Well. Today I thought we would talk about something that's been kind of in a lexicon lately called unconscious bias. And I know what a lot of people are saying. I'm like, oh, there's Brian again talking about some of that HR, politically correct, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, well, I think that there's some misconceptions when people mention unconscious bias. I was listening to some other podcasts recently, and it seems, and I don't think, obviously I don't know how many people feel this way, but it seems that there's a lot of people who think it's just another way to say somebody's racist or to say somebody's bigoted. And that's not the case at all. So, I always tell people about my, background in social work and working in child welfare, but this is something that's coming up in a lot of areas of human resources, and it's actually it's actually a lot of problems with unconscious bias. So I was actually picked to be on a committee about a year and a half ago, because my organization is discussing unconscious bias, and I was a part of a committee to address unconscious bias in the hiring process, and again, one of the, out of the gate, one of the biggest things that we talked about was how it's not racist, and I wanted to get people to realize that, it's even the people in the committee, because if that's what people think it is, you're not going to have buy-in. So I'm going a little tangent here. One of the biggest problems when rolling out initiatives, the execution of anything new in an organization is to get buy-in. A lot of times all these grand ideas come down from the top because some director or some vice president went to a seminar or went to a convention, and they get back and they're all excited, and then they try to push it on to the organization, and it rolls down here, and then the CEO, let's say, gets excited, and then all his vice presidents and everybody, they take it up, and now it's part of the vision, and then they roll it down to the directors, and then down to the management, and so forth. And by the time it gets to the line staff, there's really no buy-in, because how many initiatives does any one giant organization come up with? And there's, we have, whether it's the government, a public sector or a private sector, come up all the time, and they just kind of fade away. It's like they don't talk about it after the rollout. And the reason that is because people don't buy into it, because it's just like, that's just something else that I have to do, I talk a lot about the 4 disciplines of execution and the whirlwind, and we're going to talk a whole lot about that on another podcast, but people are busy, and they don't really care about taking up the social agendas of the organization. Now, if you get a bird's eye view, if you get your MBA, or if you become, if you rise up to a position of leadership, you understand that the stakeholders are not just the shareholders, for one, and they're not just the employees. They're people in the community. They're anyone that organization affects with its services or products. So then, yes, you have to kind of have a socially conscious vision incorporated into your business plan. But unconscious bias is just, a lot of people are sick of the kind of politically correct culture we live in. And, I'm not one of those people who will say, our culture is political correctness run amok. You hear that a lot. Well, yeah, usually it depends on who's saying it, and almost everyone's politically correct when it talks about some things. Some people you will feel that everyone has their sacred cows, so some people are, you can't, it's about race, right? And some people it's about, you can't talk about race. And some people, it's religion. And some people, it's the military. Don't ever disrespect our troops. Well, I'm not disrespecting our troops. I'm talking about we shouldn't have bombed this. No, you're disrespecting our troops. So everyone has their sacred cows. Unconscious bias kind of becomes a trigger word for some of these things that people feel that they're being blamed for something. So one of the things I just kind of want to get off my chest a little bit is that, yes, it's another new term. Yes, it's, a lot of intellectuals have studied this, and yes, you're probably going to see it in your organizations or in your community group meetings or whatever. But I think it's a very important topic because for one, and the way to get buy-in is to start off with it is not racism. So when you talk about it, if somebody, especially unfortunately in our country, there's a lot of people, and I'll just say it like white males, they get very defensive when you bring up things that sound like you're talking about race or racism because fairly or unfairly, there's a lot of people who feel that they've been blamed for things that they don't feel that they've done. And we can get, and that's that's probably another 3 or 4 podcasts. But I think this is an important topic because, and I think this actually, when you listen, you're going to get more buy-in when you actually see what unconscious bias is. So first, when talking about it, it is not racism. And then the second point you want to make is that we all have it. It doesn't matter what color you are, what gender, what religious group, everyone has unconscious bias, and probably in multiple areas. So let's just start there. So when I talk about unconscious bias, I'm not, you can never lecture about it really. You can say, well, this is what I've learned about it, but you're always in the process, even if you're the one discussing it, of improving and trying to be more and more insightful about your own biases yourself. And I think if you start there, you're going to get more buy-in and people will start to begin to listen. So that's why I went on that whole minute talking about about why it's not racism and why we need to get buy-in for this, because there are a lot of issues in the world today, and a lot of them surround unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias if it's not racism? Well, basically, it's just, the things that we have that we've built up since birth to where we make judgments on people and groups of people, based on based on the information we have, right? And sometimes those things aren't correct. Often they're not correct, and it can be harmful. So let's take it a step back and go back to like the hiring process. And the reason I'm using that is because it seems to probably be one of the safest platforms to talk about, because everyone at some point is going to apply for a job. Unconscious bias might not be about race. What if it's about somebody who has children? Well, often if a woman is applying for a job and she has kids, and even if she's married, even she or has a partner, that could be looked at as a negative in a lot of industries. You've heard about the Silicon Valley work ethic, where people are just at their desk coding, day in and day out. They sleep at their desks. They that's why, a lot of people think, a lot of these Silicon Valley companies are great places to work. It's like, oh, they offer, cots and beds and free soda and a cafeteria that's only, down the hall from your office. Well, the reason they do that is so you stay there like 24 hours. It's not always a benevolent thing. And so imagine somebody who has children that's applying to one of those companies, and that comes out during the interview. I could see how somebody would look at that as a negative. Well, how is she going to be able to keep up? And yes, men typically don't have that stereotype of a man. They don't even ask men if they have kids sometimes, and I don't think, from a HR standpoint, you shouldn't be asking those type of questions in an interview anyway, but and also an interview is not supposed to, a good interview is not just supposed to be a question and answer session. It's supposed to be a discussion, and things come out in discussions. And sometimes people volunteer information because they want to seem like, they're regular people, and they want to put on a good impression. And those things can often be used against them, unfortunately. Now, there's a lot of tools and a lot of conscious thought that's been put into the interview process in recent years, but there's still problems surrounding that. So why is recognizing our unconscious bias is important? Well, it could be anything from dating to jobs to getting hired to, well, let's talk about the big one. And I think this is a big one, and police shootings. Okay. You'll even hear people on the news station say that, the amount of black men killed by police officers, racist police officers and this and racist police officers that. So yeah, obviously that's a hot button issue. And, but see, here's the thing. I have law enforcement in my family. I have law enforcement as friends, and let me tell you, I'm not going to go through the whole thing that everyone always says. Yes, it's a difficult job. Yes, it's a dangerous job. We all know that. I find it hard to believe that anybody. Well, first of all, let's say racism. Racism really means that you think that your race is superior to that of another. Okay, doesn't mean that you're necessarily violent. It's just what you believe. So how would that result in a police shooting? Well, it wouldn't really. I think that even if the most racist, let's say there are racist cops, and I'm sure there are racists in every profession. I think the racist cops probably don't shoot people. They're the ones that are paranoid that blacks and Jews and whatever, or Mexicans have too much power and that they would get in trouble. They're the ones who would probably not, they'd be the least likely to actually commit something that would get them out of a job. And first of all, I don't think anybody would wake up in the morning and say, well, you know what? I think I'm going to kill somebody of another ethnic group, just because, because I'm angry with them. That's ridiculous. Nobody's going to throw their life and their livelihood away, or potentially throw their life or livelihood away for any political view, in my opinion. Unless it was an actual civil war in this country, no one's going to do that on the job. There are people who feel that way. People who do the school shootings, terrorists, people who bomb clinics, and people who will put their politics on a level to where they're willing to give their lives and to do a lot of damage. But people usually don't do that on the job. And usually things, when it comes to violence on the job, it's usually against their employer. It's not against their customers, statistically. So do I believe that police shootings are a problem? Well, they're not as common. The reason we, as a country, we recognize it's a problem because of the disproportionality of it. But I think that unconscious bias, how it plays into it is, if you are in a particular neighborhood and there's a lot of crime in that neighborhood, if you know that there's a certain percentage of people in that neighborhood who carry weapons, unconscious bias can kick in, and it can make you more wary. It can make you more trigger happy. A lot of people will watch YouTube videos and they'll see a white person getting arrested. They're like, oh, well, if he was black, he'd have been shot. Well, maybe not, Our prisons are disproportionately full of black people who weren't killed. So there is disproportionality in the system. But most interactions with police officers do not result in a death. The likelihood of somebody being killed by a cop is extremely unlikely. And when that does happen, I don't think it's, again, the cop woke up that morning and thought that they were going to kill somebody. But do I think unconscious bias can play into it? Yes. Now, why do I harp on unconscious bias instead of calling them racist? Why is that important? Well, it's probably not important to the family of the person who was shot and killed. No. But as far as resolving problems, we have to start thinking of that as unconscious bias. Because one is an HR problem and one's a civil rights problem, right? If it's racism, if it's systemic racism, then that's a problem that's way above, this discussion. But I don't think that's what will get somebody shot on the street by law enforcement. Unconscious bias can, and unconscious bias can do things, regardless of the race. And what I mean by that, and I know it sounds like I'm stuttering, is because I'm trying to be a little bit careful with what I say, trying to be a little bit politically correct, even though I don't like that term. So for example, disproportionality, most of you know, is when one group is represented, usually in a negative way in a system, above what their population is in the general society, right? So if black people are 15% of the population, but they make up, let's say, 45% of the kids in foster care. That was disproportionate. So when I was in child welfare, we talked about disproportionality and how unconscious bias can play a role in when it comes to the removal of children. But what we found out is that, and this is why I'm saying it's unconscious bias is so different than racism, that they did studies. And this is when I learned this from a black female PhD. And she turned me on these studies, and I actually went myself and I researched this myself. And in communities where the majority of the social workers were African American, black children were still removed at the same rate as in communities where the majority of social workers were non-black. So let me say that again. In communities where the social workers were the majority of social workers were African American, they still removed black kids at a disproportionate rate. And that rate was pretty much the same as the rest of the country. So are those social workers racist? Well, they're black, right? A lot of black men who are shot by cops, a lot of the times those cops are also black. Does that mean that those cops are racist? Does it mean that there's self-hate? Well, some people will say, yeah, black people, there's a lot of self-hate among black people, and that's why a black cop would kill a black person. No, that's not why that happens. What happens is that people think certain groups of people, it's not even a group of people, because it's not even always about race. And the reason I say this is because I when I was a teenager, I was pulled over by, well, I wouldn't say pulled over because I wasn't in a car, but the first time of my negative interactions with law enforcement, right? I was at a 7-Eleven and I was with a bunch of friends, some were black, some were Filipino. Most of them were Filipino. And it was I was in high school, so it was the late 80s, probably 80, 89. I'm thinking. And, you had the Raiders jackets and, that was the style back then, that gangster, NWA look, right? And a bunch of cops rolled up on us. We're in a parking lot of 7-Eleven. I don't think they were called. They might have been called, but I don't think they were. Had us all up against the car, told one of us, hey, if he moves again, he's going to get shot. And they said that. That was, was I scared? Kinda, but, we were in the parking lot of 7-Eleven. I thought I was angry, I was like, cause we weren't doing anything. Well, we actually did have a party going on down the street, but they didn't pull us over at the party. They just pulled us over because we were a bunch of teenagers hanging out in front of 7-Eleven. Now, did they pull us over because of our race, our ethnicities? Maybe, and again, we weren't pulled over. They just kind of rolled up on us. Another time, and it was probably like a year later, I was walking down the street and a cop just rolled up on me and he stopped me. He says, hey, where are you going? And I'm walking home. And he says that, and again, I was dressed like, a certain way and, the way teenagers were dressed back then. And he's just like, yeah, well, we're looking for somebody who's fit your description. And I was like, okay. And he's like, yeah, somebody stole a car and, you look like the person we're looking for. Like, and I was a smart ass. I'm like, well, do you see me driving? I'm walking. Obviously, if I stole a car, you wouldn't be able to like roll up on a person that's walking, right? And again, and then fortunately for me, that's all that happened. And on both occasions, the cops rolled away. Then I fast forward to my adult life, where, I drive nicer cars. I dress in most of the time business casual, and all my interactions with the police are pretty positive. They say hi, they go, what's up? I've even had cops, just talk to me about sports, while I'm at the gas station. Um, when I was a social worker, I would drive around, and I worked with police officers all the time. They would sometimes have to accompany me to go to certain areas, certain homes, and the more professional I looked, the more positive my interactions were with police officers, and I've had hundreds of interactions with police officers as an adult. And so, and I know a lot of people saying, "Oh, are you saying that black people need to dress a certain way in order to not be killed?" No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the bias was probably my youth, and yeah, probably the way I dressed. Is that unconscious bias is not fair. so I don't. That's not. So I want everyone to get that. It's not fair. What I'm saying is that it's not necessarily to do with race. It could be partly to do with race, but my skin color didn't change. My attitude may have changed a little bit. Maybe I wasn't so much of a smartass. My dress has definitely changed. The type of vehicles I drive have changed. My economics has changed. And I'm not saying that those things are fair to judge people on either. Okay, I'm not saying that that's right either. But what I'm saying is that when we talk about unconscious bias, especially when it comes to law enforcement and their interactions with minority groups, it is different from racism, and it can be fixed. It can be trained, or trained out of you, I should say. People can become more aware of this. It's not something that they grew up with that, and I can see why, people in certain communities will feel this way, that they think that, well, this person never liked black people. They never liked Mexican people. And now they grow up and they have power and they have guns and they're going to be out to kill them. And I think that's a destructive attitude to have. First of all, it's incorrect. Second, it doesn't solve the problem. But I am acknowledging that there is a problem. So I just want people to think about that and how and how can we solve these problems? Well, yeah, there's the HR component, right? We can give better training to people, and I'm picking on cops right now because that's the biggest example I can think of where unconscious bias can have the most dire result. But obviously we all have it. Like, I'm in HR. If I have a certain bias against someone during an investigation or during a hiring process, that person may not get a job. That person could lose a job based on my bias. So I'm not saying that I'm above this, and I have to always keep on my P's and Q's and make sure that, that I'm consulting and make sure that I'm aware of what's going on and my emotions towards a particular individual, and try to be as objective as possible at all times. And so what about in the community, So we talk about the HR component and how police departments and stuff, they can incorporate better trainings. HR departments can incorporate better trainings for social workers, for teachers, for even people who are, even HR themselves needs to be trained in unconscious bias. And my organization is kind of ahead of the curve, and they're doing that. That's kind of why I'm talking about it today. But what about in our communities, right? Because I am a firm believer that most of these problems can't be solved by government entities, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's, cities, counties, even the states, the federal government. What I would like to see is unconscious bias, in the church communities and nonprofits, and when they start discussing it with average citizens, that's when we're going to see big changes. Because one of those ways to strip away unconscious bias is to just show people that those biases aren't true, and that stereotypes of any nature. Stereotypes are wrong, not because there's absolutely no truth to them. It's just because they're incomplete. So, and that's not my saying. I learned that on the job. Again, my organization's ahead of the curve. But let me say that again, because I think it's powerful and it's something that stuck with me. And I wish I remembered who said it, because it's probably my training development coordinator. But it's, I'll say it again, is that stereotypes are wrong because they're incomplete, not because there's no truth to them. Is there crime in certain black communities? Yes. Are there black people who carry weapons? Yes. Are there black people who are criminals? Yes. Are there black people who are in gangs? Yes. Are there black people who deal drugs? Yes. Okay. Those things are true. But if you look at any community where there's black people in it, are the majority of the black people any of those things I just mentioned? Absolutely not. So the people who are not, and I'm not saying, and this is a burden on you, and it's an unfair burden. And I want to be the first to say that it's an unfair burden. But if we want to protect our brothers and sisters out there, one way is to actually embrace the police officers in our community. And I know this podcast started off as something just on unconscious bias, and it's gone into like community and law enforcement and all this. But this is kind of the biggest thing, and hopefully I could bring this back around full circle. But another example, which involves law enforcement, was when I worked with a wraparound group. And basically wraparound was it's not an initiative, but it's an idea in social science and community development, where instead of bringing a person, in my case it was children, to all these different services, we're going to send them here for school, we're going to send them there for therapy, we're going to send them there for family therapy, and then they got to go somewhere else for drug counseling. Let's say they were teenagers, they were on drug counseling. We're going to start bringing a lot of these stuff to the child or to the family. And in one of the cases that I remember, and it was amazing, the wraparound team can be composed of pretty much anybody who's in that family's life. So family members, social workers, sometimes even attorneys would show up, probation officers if somebody in the family was on probation, probation officer. And then one time, a neighborhood cop was called in because they did a lot of work with this family. And the cool thing is that he came in full uniform in his blues. He had his gun on him, and everybody would, at my organization at the time was like, wow, how does that work? Because the kid that we were directly dealing with was gang involved. And it was just like, he wasn't, a hardcore guy, but he could be. Like, we were worried that he was going in that direction. And so what happened was that the uncle knew the cop, and the cop had a lot of run-ins with this kid, right? And so the cop's like, yeah, and the social worker asked, brilliant social worker, she's since retired, but asked this cop to be part of the team. So a lot of people were asking me, and I was the counselor, I was called a youth development counselor. That was my position. And, well, what happens if this, or what happens if that? What happens if that cop sees that kid, stealing a car? What happens if that kid pulls a gun on the cop when they're out at a park? That person could kill that kid. And I'm like, and I would think about those things, and when I first got there. But after, it actually turned out to be a successful case. I mean, we did it with, I was with that family for probably 6-7 months. And that kid actually ended up joining the military. He thought it was his best option, and he did have some criminal stuff early on, but they were able to seal it. And what I can articulate now, what I couldn't articulate then, because I was just a young buck in the social services world, but what I can articulate now is that, well, what was the result of having a police officer come to a gang affiliate's home once a month and sit at the dinner table of that gang affiliate's grandmother and that gang affiliate kid? Well, one, that police officer got to know that family. So if that police officer was to see that child doing something, he would probably approach that kid with more humanity and more empathy. Two, that kid is probably going to approach that cop with more humanity and more empathy as well, right? Three, if that kid's going to be arrested, if I ever was going to be arrested, I'd rather it be a friend. So, the chances of that kid being abused by a cop, or at least that cop, or that cop and his immediate partners was less, right? And the gang members in the neighborhood, if you see, if you know for a fact that a police officer is going to this person's house at least once a month, how much are you really going to bring them in on your criminal activities? Think about that. Are you really going to want them to deal for you? Are you really going to want them to do work for you, go out there and commit crimes? Are you going to trust them with your secrets? Or are you going to kind of like keep them at arm's length? And here's the thing. As much as we see in the movies, do you really want to go after that guy because he's not hanging out with you that much anymore and try to put the screws to him when you know the cop's coming to his house and a cop knows his business and a cop actually likes this kid? It actually created an umbrella of trust and protection for both the police officer and the kid and the family. So it was almost like, and I hate to use this word because people hate it, the fact that the family accepted that police officer and the police officer accepted that family, it made a safe space in a community that was supposedly controlled by this gang. But that gang didn't bother that family, at least not since, from the time that police officer became involved with them. And he kind of got left alone. He found new friends. He ended up dating a girl who wanted to join the Navy, and he joined right along with her. And the last I heard, him and the girl weren't together anymore, but he was doing well in the Navy. And from going from a gang life to that's a home run. And so, I'm talking about wraparound and all this, but the point is that the bias whatever bias that cop had for that kid and whatever bias that kid had for that cop disappeared the more engagement was had. The more they engaged with one another, the less bias there was, and the safer both of them became. Right? Because now that cop knew the name of his friend. I mean, did that kid become a big snitch? I don't think so, but they would talk like friends. And so he was able to trust that, I can talk freely around this person, and I'm not going to be abused. I'm not going to get thrown in jail for, anything. I mean, he didn't confess to any murders or anything like that, but he found that, he found a way out, and that way out wasn't me. That way out wasn't, the probation officer. That way out was the last person he probably thought of. And just imagine if an entire community could embrace their local police department, and that police department would embrace that community back. And it doesn't even have to be all the community. It could be, even if it was only like 40% of that community said, you know what, we're gonna talk to our police officers when we see them on the street. We're gonna say hi to them, say how they're doing, on a hot day, let them have a glass of water or whatever, if they're outside your house or whatever. That's going to make your community safe. That's going to take away unconscious bias. And you'll see that most people, are not anti-cop and they're not racist, and I'm using law enforcement as just because this is the most dire example of consequences of unconscious bias that we see in the news and the media today. But let's look at things that are on smaller levels, like hiring. The more engagement, the more communication you have with the person, the better interview processes you have. The more layers you can peel away. People who don't understand. I mean, and all this stuff is cliche. All this stuff, none of this stuff is new. The more you're exposed to something, the less you're going to assume about something. And yeah, it's and again, it's not new. And I wasn't even planning on talking about it today, but I saw some things in the news, and it kind of sparked and jived with the training that I was doing. And I'm actually going to be doing a training on it in my organization. Or one of my organizations, I should say. And I'm going to be speaking about it soon too at a place, and I'll tell people about it when that's officially announced. But yeah, I didn't really get into all the fine points of unconscious bias, but hopefully I gave people an example of how unconscious bias is different than bigotry and racism, and how it can be solved, and how and not only how it can be solved, but how the I'm stumbling over my words here, but how it could be, when unconscious bias is alleviated, when it dissipates, how better outcomes can be had. And I should probably end it here before I continue to stumble over my words. But we'll talk about some of these concepts more in the future. And for now, have a good day. Thank you.